had become the aviator they never imagined they could not take to the skies without. Mayday, mayday. Total engine failure at 15,000 feet. Captain Sarah Mitchell's voice held steady as her F-16 began its downward trajectory toward the desert landscape below. Inside the control tower, the male pilots who had been betting against her survival chances fell silent. They were about to learn why the Pentagon had sealed her combat records for 15 years. What happened next not only saved her life, but proved that the most dangerous missions are often flown by aviators whose service histories remain too classified for public acknowledgement, and the woman they had wanted to see fail was about to reveal skills that exist nowhere in conventional flight training protocols. Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada had been home to the world's elite fighter pilots for over 70 years. The desert facility, known as the birthplace of tactical aviation excellence, hosted America's top aviators to prove themselves in the unforgiving skies above the Mojave Desert. The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight line as ground crews prepared F-16 Fighting Falcons for another grueling day of intensive training. Captain Sarah Mitchell walked across the scorching tarmac toward her assigned aircraft, her flight suit crisp despite the 105-degree heat typical of Nevada's July weather. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen real combat. But her assignment to Nellis was far from welcomed by her fellow pilots. The 414th Fighter Squadron had been all-male for its entire four-decade history, and most of its members intended to keep it that way. As Sarah approached her F-16, she caught fragments of conversations meant to be overheard, though they weren't exactly whispered. "Can't believe they're forcing this diversity experiment on us," muttered Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a hotshot pilot from Texas who had graduated top of his class from the Air Force Academy. "This place isn't meant for social experiments," added Captain Mike Rodriguez, shouldering his helmet bag. "Give her a week, and after one tough sortie, she'll be begging for a transfer back to hauling cargo." Staff Sergeant Tommy Walsh, the crew chief responsible for Sarah's aircraft, shook his head as he watched the men talk. He'd been working F-16s for 15 years and had seen plenty of pilots come and go. "You boys might want to take a look at her file before you start making bets," he said quietly. "What file?" Jake laughed. "Her record's thinner than paper. She probably flew transport runs and called it combat experience." What none of them knew was that Sarah's file looked thin because most of it was classified above their clearance level. The Pentagon had redacted 12 years of operations that officially never happened, missions that would stay buried in classified files for decades to come. Sarah performed her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, her hands moving over every part of the aircraft with the expertise that came from countless hours in similar cockpits. She checked the engine intakes, examined the control surfaces, and tested the weapon systems with the competence of someone who knew that attention to detail was the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic. Climbing into the cockpit, she noticed the other pilots gathered around the flight planning room, their body language making it clear they were talking about her. Through the window, she watched Jake mime an aircraft going into an uncontrolled spin, drawing chuckles from the group. The morning mission briefing had been professional, but distinctly cold. Colonel James Harrison, the squadron commander, had made it clear that Sarah's presence was due to orders from above, not his choice. The mission was routine air-to-air combat training over the Nevada Test and Training Range, with Sarah flying as the fourth ship in a flight of experienced pilots. "Mitchell," Colonel Harrison had said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who had already made up his mind. "You'll be flying wing with Morrison's element. Try to keep up." The subtext was clear. Don't embarrass yourself and don't get in the way of the real pilots. Now, strapped into her F-16 at 15,000 feet above the vast Nevada desert, Sarah was about to show them that some lessons can only be learned the hard way. The flight had been airborne for 23 minutes when Sarah's engine started showing unusual readings. At first, the signs were subtle. A slight fluctuation in exhaust gas temperature, a minor variance in fuel flow, but Sarah's trained eye caught the anomalies immediately. "Lead from 4. I'm showing abnormal engine parameters," she radioed calmly. Jake Morrison's voice came back with barely concealed irritation. "Roger 4, probably just nerves. Continue with the exercise." But Sarah knew better. She'd seen this exact pattern before, in another desert, during a mission that didn't exist in any official record. The memory was crystal clear. The same engine fluctuations, the same gradual power loss, the same inevitable result. Lead from 4. I need to return to base immediately. Engine failure imminent. This time Jake's response carried open mockery. Come on, Mitchell. We're 10 minutes into the exercise, and you're already looking for an excuse to quit. 4. Colonel Harrison's voice crackled from the lead aircraft. Stay in formation. Complete the mission. That's when Sarah's engine exploded. The F-16 shuddered violently as metal fragments tore through the engine bay. Warning lights lit up the cockpit like a deadly Christmas tree, and smoke began seeping through the air conditioning system. At 15,000 feet, with no engine power and limited gliding range, most pilots would have pulled the ejection handles immediately. Mayday, mayday. Engine failure at 15,000 feet. Sarah's voice remained steady even as her aircraft became a $30 million glider with very limited options. In the control tower at Nellis, the atmosphere changed instantly. Casual chatter stopped. Coffee cups were set down with shaking hands, and every eye focused on the radar scope showing Sarah's aircraft beginning its inevitable descent. Lieutenant Morrison's voice came over the radio, his earlier cockiness replaced by genuine concern. 4. Eject now. But Sarah was already running calculations in her head. Wind speed, altitude, distance to suitable landing areas, glide ratio, and a dozen other factors that most pilots would never consider in an emergency. What she saw in her mind wasn't the Nevada desert below, but the mountains of Afghanistan, where she had once performed a similar miracle that saved not only her life, but the lives of 8 special operations soldiers who had been counting on her for extraction. Negative on ejection, Sarah replied calmly. I'm bringing her home. The control tower erupted in protests. Mitchell, that's impossible. Dead stick landing in an F-16 has never been done. What they didn't know was that it had been done by Captain Sarah Mitchell over the Hindu Kush Mountains in 2018 during an operation so classified that even its existence was denied by the Pentagon. As Sarah began her descent, muscle memory took over. Her hands moved across the cockpit controls with practiced efficiency, configuring the aircraft for maximum gliding performance. She lowered the landing gear to increase drag and improve glide characteristics, a counterintuitive move that most pilots would never consider. Tower, I need emergency equipment standing by. I'm coming in on runway 03 left. Mitchell, you're 8 miles out with no power. It can't be done. But Sarah had already calculated the glide path. In her mind, she could see every foot of the approach, every factor that would affect her descent. This wasn't theory. It had been tested in combat, refined under enemy fire, and proven when failure meant not just her death, but the loss of a mission that had taken months to plan. As the F-16 descended through 5,000 feet, Sarah made minute adjustments to her flight path, using her knowledge of desert thermals and wind patterns to stretch her glide. In the tower, veteran controllers who had seen thousands of landings watched in amazement as the powerless fighter maintained a perfect approach. She's actually going to make it, whispered the tower supervisor, a man who had been at Nellis for 25 years. At 1,000 feet, Sarah deployed her drag chute early, trading airspeed for a steeper descent that would put her exactly where she needed to be. The F-16 touched down on runway centerline at 180 knots, rolled for almost 2 miles, and came to a stop just 500 feet from the runway's end. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within seconds, but Sarah was already shutting down systems and preparing to egress. When she climbed out of the cockpit, she found a crowd that included every pilot from her squadron, ground crew who had stopped their work to watch, and Colonel Harrison himself. The silence lasted for almost 30 seconds before Jake Morrison stepped forward. His face was pale, and his voice carried none of its earlier arrogance. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "how did you know how to do that?" Sarah pulled off her helmet and looked at the gathered crowd. For a moment, she considered giving them the standard answer, training, instinct, luck. But these men had just witnessed something that demanded explanation. "Because I've done it before," she said simply. Colonel Harrison stepped closer, his expression unreadable. Mitchell, your file shows transport and training assignments. When could you have possibly— Sir, Sarah interrupted gently. My file shows what the Pentagon wants it to show. Some missions don't make it into official records. That night, Colonel Harrison made a phone call to a number he wasn't supposed to have, to a person he wasn't supposed to know. The conversation was brief, but when it ended, he sat staring at his desk for almost an hour. The next morning, Sarah found a new flight assignment on her desk. Not a reprimand or a transfer, but lead pilot for the squadron's most challenging training missions. Attached was a note from Colonel Harrison. Some lessons can only be taught by someone who has already survived them. Jake Morrison approached her before the briefing. His entire demeanor had changed. Ma'am, I owe you an apology, and if you're willing to teach, I'd like to learn how to be half the pilot you are. Sarah looked at the young man who had been so eager to see her fail. The most important thing I can teach you, Lieutenant, is that being a pilot isn't about proving you're better than someone else. It's about making sure everyone comes home. In the weeks that followed, the squadron's attitude toward Sarah underwent a complete transformation. The men who had dismissed her as a diversity hire began asking for her input on advanced flying techniques. The pilots who had made jokes about women and fighters found themselves learning from someone whose experience dwarfed their own. Sarah never spoke about the classified missions that had prepared her for that day over Nevada. She didn't need to. The proof of her abilities had been written in the sky during 8 minutes of flawless flying that turned a catastrophic engine failure into a textbook landing. 6 months later, when Lieutenant Morrison successfully executed his own emergency landing after a bird strike damaged his engine, he credited the techniques Sarah had taught him with saving his life. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the squadron. The woman they hadn't wanted had become the teacher they couldn't do without. Colonel Harrison, who had initially resented Sarah's assignment to his squadron, wrote in her fitness report, "Captain Mitchell represents the finest traditions of Air Force aviation. Her technical skills, combat experience, and leadership abilities make her an invaluable asset to any unit lucky enough to have her." But perhaps the most significant change came at a squadron party 6 months after Sarah's emergency landing. As the pilots shared stories and celebrated another successful training cycle, Jake Morrison stood up and raised his beer in a toast. "To Captain Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the respect of someone who had learned a valuable lesson. "The pilot who showed us that skill has no gender, and heroes don't always look like what we expect." The response was unanimous. "Hear, hear." Sarah smiled and raised her own glass. "To good flying and safe returns," she replied, "and to remembering that we're all on the same side." As the night went on, Sarah found herself surrounded by pilots eager to hear more about advanced emergency procedures, high-altitude flying techniques, and the mental preparation required for combat missions. The woman who had once been seen as an unwelcome intruder had become the backbone of a squadron that was stronger, more skilled, and more united than it had ever been. But late that night, as Sarah reviewed the day's flight reports, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Not because she had proved herself to the men who had doubted her, but because she had found a way to pass on knowledge that might someday save lives. The classified missions would remain classified. The operations that had shaped her skills would never appear in any official history, but in a squadron of fighter pilots who now understood that excellence knows no gender, her legacy would live on every time one of them faced an emergency with the confidence that comes from learning from the best. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that don't make the news. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones whose credentials can't be hung on the wall. And sometimes the people others don't want turn out to be exactly the people everyone needs. Captain Sarah Mitchell had proved all of these things in 8 minutes of perfect flying over the Nevada desert. And in doing so, she had changed not just her own career, but the lives and attitudes of every pilot who had witnessed her grace under pressure. The woman they didn't want,